remember the first time that I ever saw the ocean. It's clear, it's burnt into my brain. It was cloudy outside. I even remember the weather. It was cloudy. The hotel we were staying in around Fort Lauderdale was huge and pink, a bright, obnoxiously Floridian building down in Fort Lauderdale. We walked past this building, and then you just see the ocean. And when it comes to describing the ocean, it's almost impossible to really capture what it is, right? I mean, if someone walked up and you said, "I've never heard of this ocean before, what is it?" You'd say, "Well, it's a bunch of water, and it's kind of on all of this sand." And you just look at that. Sounds so boring until you actually stare out at it and you just realize how big it is and how small you are. The ocean has always been this captivating presence in our world. It's for ages and centuries and millennia. It's just captivated the hearts and the minds of people. They've seen how calm and calming it can be, and then just how in a blink of an eye it can become furious, it can become strong, it can become deadly. And the thought always lays before us of what is on the other side, who's staring at the ocean from the opposite end, either in Europe or Asia or wherever we're standing at. Who is out there? What is beyond us? Today we're going to be picking up in the book of Acts chapter 27. And we're going to be seeing Paul setting out to sail on the sea. We're going to be seeing Paul sail on the sea, and the entire chapter is going to detail what happens to him as he is afloat on this ship, moving toward the city of Rome with a few detours along the way. And what I want us to see is that as we're traveling with Paul on this boat in Acts 27, we're going to be taken to two different places. We're going to be taken to two places in this text. First, we're going to be taken to the end of ourselves. We're going to be taken to the end of ourselves, and then we're going to be taken to the ends of the earth. Acts 27, we're going to read the entire chapter and then a few verses into the next one this morning. Acts 27. Paul has been in prison for the past several chapters for the offense that he has caused the Jewish leaders. They've accused him of false crimes, and he's again and again been declared to be innocent. He has appealed to Caesar, and then his rulers have said, "You have appealed to Caesar you shall go." And now this is going to show how Paul eventually makes it from where he's been kept in Caesarea to Rome in Italy. Verse 1, Acts 27. And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, which is about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. And putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra and Lycia. There the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty at Cnidus. And as the wind did not allow us to go further, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmon. Coasting along with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lycia. Since much time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, "Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there, on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. And when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck down from the land. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island.' When the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on, they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under pretense of laying out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, 'Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved.' Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, 'Today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength, for not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you.' And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then they all were encouraged and ate some food themselves. We were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. Now when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach, on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach, but striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. After we were brought safely through, we learned that the island was called Malta. The native people showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and welcomed us all, because it had begun to rain and was cold. When Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. When the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "No doubt this man is a murderer. Though he has escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." He, however, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. They were waiting for him to swell up or suddenly fall down dead, but when they had waited a long time and saw no misfortune come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. So in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the chief man of the island named Publius, who received us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. It happened that the father of Publius lay sick with fever and dysentery, and Paul visited him and prayed, and putting his hands on him, healed him. And when this had taken place, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured. They also had honored us greatly, and we were about to sail. They put on board whatever we needed. This is the word of the Lord for us this morning. What a story. It's a long one, but I mean, what a story, right? You see this, it's just this amazing sea travel narrative where this storm falls down and they're cast away for 14 days, being thrown everywhere, and they keep throwing stuff off the boat, and the storm gets worse, and they keep throwing stuff off the boat, and the storm gets worse, and then miracle of miracles, they somehow all make it through because of what Paul's doing. Then they end up on this island. Paul gets bit by a snake. He lives, and then he goes about healing people to and fro. This is an exciting, amazing account to read, and you just have to think that Paul has seen a thing or two by the end of this. But one thing for us to keep in mind, just as we read this isn't Paul's first shipwreck. In fact, in 2 Corinthians 11:25, we're told that Paul went through 3 different shipwrecks. But this is the first time that we read of one happening in the book of Acts. And in fact, even though Luke has mentioned that Paul has traveled by sea a number of times, this is the first time that we're actually told the details of what being shipwrecked looked like for Paul. And we need to ask the question, why of all the times that Paul gets shipwrecked does he include this one here at this point in his story? And why does he spend so much time going into detail about these 14 days at sea when he's summarized whole years in maybe a verse or two? Right? Where he'll just be like, and then Paul went through the area just preaching the gospel and encouraging the saints, right? Well, it'd be nice to know what that was like, but we have a chapter and a half of this shipwreck and this recovery. Why does Luke go into so much detail here at this point? I think what it's supposed to do, what we're supposed to be seeing here, is that this is kind of the culmination of Paul's being put on trial. This is the culmination of Paul being on trial before the watching world. We've already mentioned Paul has been arrested back in Acts 21. He's been on trial ever since then, and again and again and again, no matter who he is in front of, they declare him innocent. The centurion that first arrested him said that he does not appear to do anything wrong. Then he goes to Felix, and Felix can't find anything to pin on him. Festus can't find anything to pin on him. Agrippa can't find anything to pin on him. Again and again and again, we have seen this phrase show up. This man is innocent. This man is not guilty of anything. And it's here in this chapter that it seems as if heaven and earth themselves, through the storm, are declaring that Paul is innocent. Sailors have always been considered to be a kind of superstitious group of folks. There's even the saying, red light at night, or red sky at night, sailor's delight. Red sky in the morning, sailor's warning, right? Some people consider it bad to have clergy on board their ships because clergy are kind of like Paul. And shipwrecks seem to happen to Paul a lot, right? Shipwreck 3 times isn't a great track record. Or Jonah, right? We're all the same, cut from the same cloth. These men of God just seem to cause shipwrecks. Some people even think bananas are bad luck. I couldn't figure out why, in particular, that one was of all the fruits that were bad luck to have on board, bananas. Some sailors have considered bad luck. But the reason why is because sailing has always been dangerous. And it's always seemed when you're on the sea like this that you need a little bit more than skill. You need a little bit more than your own ingenuity. You need a little bit more than your own experience to survive. And the sea is kind of held up as this theater of providence, the place where the world kind of sorted out the wrongs that were done on it that human beings overlooked. So if you were lost at sea, it was usually kind of assumed, well, you probably had it coming to you, or at least someone on your ship did. But Paul, in this story, not only is delivered from the shipwreck, but because of the things he says, actually ends up saving his whole crew. Paul ends up not being condemned by the storm, but delivered from it and vindicated by it. But it only comes about after this long bout of human effort. That's our first point this morning. The first place that this text is supposed to take us, that this journey is supposed to take us, is to the end of ourselves. Notice how it begins with these characters. We're introduced to the centurion named Julius, and then these 2 other men that are mentioned in these early verses here, this owner of the ship and the pilot. We get this long kind of detailed stop-by-stop trip, right, of all these places that we can't pronounce and these places that we don't know, and just kind of saying Paul's meandering down the coast, trying to get to somewhere that he can sail to get to Rome. But it takes so long to get there that it says that they're after the fast. This is probably referring to the Jewish fast, the Day of Atonement. And what that means is that we're getting into the late fall at this point. And it was normal during this time of year, as soon as late fall hit, you wouldn't sail again until spring because the oceans were so dangerous. You would just kind of cut your losses, you'd harbor up somewhere, and you would just bunker down for the winter, because if you were trying to go out on your own, it was pretty much guaranteed you were not going to make it to where you were going. And that's exactly what Paul tries to tell them in verse 10. Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. And what he's saying there, this isn't some miraculous word from God. This is common sense. Paul's been through a shipwreck or two, and he kind of says, I trust me, I understand what it's like to try to get somewhere urgently, but this is not going to bode well for us. We are going to end up in a pickle. But who did they listen to? They don't listen to Paul. They listen to the owner of the ship and to the pilot, two men who thought that they could hold things together. These people who have seen a winter or two. These men who have traversed some difficult seas, these men who have been through some stuff, and they're confident they have enough bravery, they have enough experience, they have enough guts that they're going to be able to make the voyage that they need to make, even in this most dangerous season, that they can at least get down to Phoenix and spend the winter there. But despite all of their skill, despite their bravery, despite their guts, what we find in this storm is that they are not able to make it. It begins easily enough in verse 13. The wind blows gently, but then it changes just a verse later. This tempestuous wind, this stormy wind, this northeaster blows up, and it just carries them along the sea. They can do nothing about it. They fight for days, and they're driven along. They try to pull up and secure the boat. They are able to do that. They throw their rigging overboard. They're violently storm-tossed, and then they end up having to just begin jettisoning things because it's all that they can do. They will need the ship light so that it will stay afloat. They'll not be sunk. They'll not be destroyed, but nothing they're able to do is able to save them. So that we get down to verse 20, it says, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. These people realize they have come to the end of their skill set. This is not a situation in which they are naturally going to be able to save themselves. And no amount of skill, ingenuity, or bravery is going to be able to get them out of this situation. Their last hope of being saved, of being delivered, of being rescued was abandoned. And these are the men who were so brave at the start of this text. Those who were confident that they were going to be able to do exactly what they needed to do. And what this simply reminds us of, what we're seeing here, is mankind coming up against a wall that is not able to climb on its own. You know, I heard a quote from this man named John Piper. He says, no one goes to the Grand Canyon to build self-esteem. Right? No one just goes to the edge of the Grand Canyon, just looks over this and just says, it was so great of me to come out here. I'm so accomplished. I drove all the way here from Denver, right? No one does that. Because why? Because it captivates you with how big it is, with how majestic it is, with how small you are in comparison to it, right? But that's the same thing with the sea here. There's so many situations in our lives in which we are reminded we, despite our accomplishments as a society, despite our accomplishments as individuals, despite our accomplishments as families or a nation or a state, despite all of the things that we feel like we are able to do, just like that, everything can change. Just like that. And it's not just that these external alien forces come against us. The very world we live in can kill us. When we talk about the ocean, right, we say, well, how do you describe it? Well, it's just a bunch of water. That doesn't sound intimidating. Until you see waves that are 40 feet in the air, waves that drop you 40 feet down below the sea level and then scoop you back up again. The world is a scary place. But we, especially as modern people, are so prone to thinking that we have all things under control. And then what we're reminded of in this text is the fact that that thought that we have things in control, that we can manage our lives, that we can keep things going well, that is no new problem. That is nothing new to the human heart. We have been convinced that our strength, effort, and ingenuity will be able to get us through things, and sometimes the world simply tells us that is not the case. And we can test this right now because I can ask you, what do you do when something goes wrong in your life? What do you do? Probably, if you're anything like me, you have one of two responses. Either you try harder, you try to fix it yourself, you try to use your own abilities to make the problem better, whatever the problem is, or you panic and you run the other way because you realize that there's nothing that you are able to do. But we are always convinced until that moment that there is something else that we are able to do. Our society, the people that we live among, us ourselves, we are obsessed with the thought that technique will save us. That the way to get through life is by figuring out the right system, figuring out the right set of do's and don'ts, figuring out the right diet or the right opinions or the right schools to send your kids to or the right child rearing techniques. We think that if we figure out the right stuff, then we will be okay. If we figure out the right way to minimize the risks on us, then we are going to make it out of this world without much pain. But all the while, we live in a world that is full of heartbreak, full of betrayal, full of sudden accidents, full of selfish motives, full of cancer diagnoses, full of extended hospital stays, full of pandemics, full of death. Ever since Genesis 3, when mankind sinned, the world has been reminding us that we are dust. Again and again and again. And despite our best efforts to try to find ways to conquer the world around us and to be rulers over it, all we are able to do is simply separate ourselves from it. Right? You realize the technology that keeps us safe, it doesn't actually bring the world into order, it just kind of puts up walls between us, right? That's what houses are. We're not just suddenly naturally better than the elements that we live in, right? We've constructed something to get us out of the elements, so we invent heating and air conditioning. Right? We don't suddenly find the ability to walk across the sea on our own. We build giant ships of metal and ballast that are able to carry us across. But eventually you are going to run into something in your life where you are not able to outspend, outmaneuver, overpower what's coming up against you. And what will you fall upon when that realization that you can hold nothing together happens? What will you fall upon when that realization that you are not able to keep your life going the way you would like to do? What are you going to fall upon then? Because you will face it, and I can tell you that you will face it, because even if your life goes great up until that moment, eventually you will die. You will die. And whether that's sudden or whether that is slow, one way or another, you will be reminded that your body simply cannot keep going. And perhaps as when I've worked in hospice, that was the most difficult thing for the folks that I ministered to understand, was that their body simply was meeting a wall. It was not going to change. And if you are not ready for that moment, then you will despair. What can you cast yourself upon? But notice as we look at this text how it progresses. Paul, who starts out as this kind of ignored, marginalized person at the beginning, by the end, his every word is being listened to, right? Notice how it's moved throughout here, right? It starts where they're, guys, I have this, it's wintertime, it's looking dangerous, I've done this before, probably best not to go. And they say, yeah, you're just a prisoner, right? And they just kind of shuttle him away somewhere else, and he says, all right, we're going to go. And then he goes, and then the ship gets carried off into the depths. They have no hope of being saved. Then verse 21, he stands up and he speaks. Men should have listened to me. right? That's always helpful, right? When someone comes along and says, well, if you'd listened to me back then we wouldn't be in this problem. But Paul is actually right. Should have listened to me and not set sail from Crete. But now he shares that the Lord, the God whom he worships, has appeared to him, tells him that he's going to stand before Caesar and he is going to grant all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, I have faith in God, verse 25, that they will be exactly as I have been told, but we must run aground. And then it continues to go on, and then he urges them to eat down in verse 33 and 34. He says, go ahead and eat. You haven't eaten for 14 days, but we might as well give thanks. Not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you. And he takes this bread, and he's just completely calm, and he breaks it. He gives thanks to the Lord for providing for it. They take and eat, and what do they say? That says that they're all greatly encouraged. And then they begin to lighten the ship, continuing to toss things out. It's as if they're beginning to listen to Paul. And even when it looks like everything is lost, they've run the ship into a reef. It begins to be torn apart. The soldiers are going to kill the prisoners. Why? Because if they lost a prisoner, they'd be held responsible for him because maybe they got away, maybe they didn't. And Paul says, don't kill a single one of them, because if you don't have them, then we're not going to survive this thing. And what do? They listen to Paul. And then, in the rest of chapter 28, it's not just that they're listening to Paul, it's that Paul is working miracles in their midst. He gets bit by a snake, shakes it off. He goes and heals Publius, his father, and begins healing everyone who comes to him. What we're seeing here as we move through this text is that these sailors, these Gentile Roman pagans, are consistently trusting in themselves less and less and less. There's kind of this downward movement of humility with them. Meanwhile, Paul is kind of having this upward rise of prominence and authority. As the situation gets worse, Paul becomes more in control again and again and again. What are we supposed to learn from that? Why is Paul able, in the midst of all of this, to know that he is going to be secure? What gives him this calm, this peace? Wouldn't you like to be calm when things are stressful in your life? When you get that call, when you get that diagnosis, when you realize that things are not going to work out the way that you've been planning to, wouldn't you like to be able to be calm when that happens? How can you be calm? You must be confident in what the Lord has promised. Paul, in this instance, he's confident that he is going to get to Caesar, that he's going to testify to Rome, because the Lord himself had appeared to him and said, I'm going to send you to Rome. Chapter 23, verse 11, take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. Verse 24 of chapter 27. He says, you will stand before Caesar. You must do it. It is going to happen. The Lord is going to complete what he has begun in you. Well, Paul is confident that he is simply being delivered by the one who he has trusted in this entire time. Again and again and again. He believes that his God truly is the one who speaks in Isaiah 42, verse 2, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. He is confident that this God who is with him is able to deliver him from this shipwreck, from this deadly peril. Why? Because the God that he trusts in has already delivered one man from the dead. Christ has been raised not simply from being beaten, not simply from being shipwrecked, but from being crucified, dead, buried in the ground for 3 days, and even from the grave he is able to rescue him. So if God can rescue Christ from the grave, then certainly he can rescue little Paul in the middle of a boat. So he presses forward. And so the question for us is, do we find our confidence in the same thing? Now notice, we're not given the certainty that exactly the situation we would like to turn out is going to turn out. We don't have that promise from the Lord that exactly this is going to happen, right? But what do we have the promise of? That we will be raised. Why? Because Christ has been already. And the Spirit has been given to us, has been given to us as this down payment. It's sealed us. It has come and regenerated our hearts and made it so that we might know we will be with Christ forever. It's this beginning of this resurrection. It's already broken into our lives so that we can find confidence not in our circumstances, not in our ability to provide for ourselves, not in our ability to have a secure, stable, safe, healthy life, but in the fact that even if all of that goes wrong, if Christ is risen, then you too will be raised. And you'll be with him forever. That is the confidence that we can have in Christ, but we must cast ourselves upon it again and again and again. We must realize that the gospel truly becomes good news when we come to the end of ourselves. When we realize that we do not have the capability to keep ourselves, but Christ has kept his people, and not one of those who come to him he will lose. That is good news. Only by coming to the end of ourselves can we come to the fullness of joy that is to be found in Jesus. By believing the gospel that we cannot save ourselves, that we cannot work for our salvation, that we cannot ultimately atone for our sin, but Christ must do it. He must be our champion. He must be the one to stand the gap, and because he has, we can have hope. So think about your deathbed. Think about the fact that you will come to the end of your strength at some point. And that is actually good news if you're in Christ. That you not being in control of everything ultimately means you must cast yourself upon a holy God. And if that God has worked as he has shown himself to in Christ, then we can have hope. By coming to the end of ourselves, we come to the fullness of joy that is in Christ. And then, what we'll continue to see in this text, not only do we come to the end of ourselves when we come to Christ, but then we are compelled to go to the ends of the earth. And we're going to focus mainly here in verse 20, in chapter 28, these first 10 verses. Have you ever had a moment where you just thought nothing possibly could go worse, and then you spill your coffee on your shirt or something like that? Or you go out and your tire's flat, or just something happens and you usually end up saying something just like, figures. About time. It's just par for the course at this point, right? That's kind of what we have at this moment. This kind of can't get much worse moment. Paul's been shipwrecked. He's been wandering around. All they've had to eat is a little bit of bread after, however long they've been on this boat. They wreck. They swim to the shore. It's cold. It's raining. These people, they're kind enough to kind of build a fire for him and welcome him. And then what happens to Paul? He's trying to put some kindling on the fire and he gets bit by a snake. Can you imagine just is the centurion just smacking his head at this point, just saying, I can't believe it. Who brought this guy along with us, right? But what happens? It turns out that it's not that things are actually getting much worse. It's actually testifying that Paul, once again, is innocent. Look at the reaction that these folks have in verse 4. The native people, it says that word there, that these native people, it literally means these barbarians. These are supposed to be the farthest off kind of people that you could possibly find. They see this creature, right? It's like Paul gets bit by a snake and he's just standing there and just kind of wagging in the breeze, right? And they're just like, oh my gosh, right? And it says, the man, he must be a murderer. He's escaped from the sea, but justice has not allowed him to live. This is their God that they believe in. The God justice has finally secured Paul's death. They tried it with the ocean. That didn't work, so he sent this snake at him, and now Paul is going to die. But Paul just kind of shakes it off. It falls into the fire. The snake is dead. Paul is fine. Now, what is happening with this story? Why does this happen? Why can't God just give Paul a little bit of a break after the shipwreck thing, at least wait a few days before the snake thing? Why does it have to happen now? Well, Jesus makes this interesting promise all the way back in Luke chapter 10 when he's talking to his disciples about them going to the ends of the earth. And there's this kind of interesting thing that happens in the Gospels where Jesus is telling his disciples, his immediate disciples, to go and do this work and to share that the kingdom is coming in Israel. But it's kind of bleeding into the way that we understand the way that we're supposed to work as we take the gospel to the ends of the earth. And the disciples come back after doing these miracles and testifying to the fact that even the demons are subject to them in Christ's name. And then he says this in verse 19. He says, "Behold, I've given you authority to tread on serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall hurt you." Jesus kind of holds up this phrase and says, "I've given you power even to trample over serpents and scorpions." Now, what is that talking about? Where is that phrase coming from? It's probably coming from the Old Testament. You get this wonderful verse in Psalm 91, this picture. Psalm 91 is just all the ways in which the Lord's going to protect his righteous one. No evil is going to fall upon the ones who are in the Lord. In verse 13 it says, you shall tread on the lion and the adder and the young lion and the serpent you will trample underfoot. And back in Deuteronomy 8, we have the same picture where Moses is talking to the people of Israel as they're about to enter the promised land. He's saying, you have been with God for 40 years in the desert. He's protected you from serpents and scorpions. What is the picture that's being held up here? God is able to protect. And it's not that this snake is somehow a testimony of the gods trying to take out Paul. It's a testimony that the forces of evil in the world, the forces of power are actually opposed to what Paul is doing. But even so, Paul will be delivered. The same God who's delivered his people in the book of Deuteronomy, the same God who is with the disciples of Christ in the book of Luke, that same God is with Paul. And the God who preserved his people from judgment and death can certainly do so again, and he does it here with Paul. So what was first thought to be the sign of Paul's guilt before a false God turns out to be a sign of faithfulness to Paul from the living God. And Paul is able to not just simply survive, but go on and administer in this abundance of resurrection power within him. He heals Publius's father who is sick with fever and dysentery. He visits him and prays, puts his hands on him, heals him, and then all the rest of the people on the island who have diseases begin to come to him. This is just continuing this pattern that we've seen throughout the book of Acts and throughout the Gospels of this miracle working power of the kingdom of God coming through God's servants. And the point that we're supposed to see here as we look at this text, as we look at what Paul is doing, that even in this shipwreck, even on him being on this far-off, no-name castaway island of Malta, even among these barbarian, superstitious, odd, strange islanders, Jesus Christ is at work through Paul. Paul has not been forgotten, but the resurrection is still true. And the thing that Paul wrote in Galatians 2, it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. That is still the case. And Paul does the work of Christ. And as we look at this passage, as we consider what we are seeing in these final chapters of Acts, what we are being taught again and again is the reality of the gospel. Christ has died and now lives, and the people that he chooses to use are these unlikely sinners, winning them to his love, and then using them to rescue the unlikely, the undeserving, the unimpressive, so that they might have life in him. And that is this work that we are supposed to see as we look at this text, and the encouragement that we're supposed to draw from this as we look at Acts 27, because sometimes it's easy to look at the early chapters of Acts and see Paul doing all these miracles, all this bold preaching, all of this evangelism, and just say, I just wish I had his boldness. I just wish I had his courage. I just wish I had his ingenuity. I just wish I had his faithfulness. But what Acts 27 is reminding us of here is none of that is Paul's own. None of that is Paul's ability to save himself. None of that is Paul's ability to save anyone. What is it that Paul has? Paul has his God. And that God can be ours if we believe in Christ. And when we believe in him, what is his power ultimately doing? It's this demonstrating that his power is made perfect in our weakness. As we are shown in ourselves to be unimpressive, Christ is shown to be magnificently glorious. And that is what the ultimate task of us is as we think about evangelism, as we think about missions. It's not saying we have to have everything together. It's asking God to meet us at the end of ourselves so that he can accomplish what we cannot do. Asking him to complete the work that he has begun, not the work that we have begun, and asking him to just kind of tidy it up a little bit. Asking him to complete the work he has begun, not only in those people who have not yet believed, but complete the work he's begun in us. That is something that's worth praying for. And what that means is that when we commit to doing this work, when we talk about doing this revitalization and this restart and seeking to reach our community, what that's going to ultimately show is not that we are an impressive church, but that we are fools, that we are wimps, that we're knuckleheads, that we have no hope in ourselves, but we have all hope in a glorious, powerful God who sits in the heavens. And if that's the case, then how can we lose? And that's good news. Paul is coming to the end of his journey. We are approaching the end of the book of Acts, and very, very soon we are going to be approaching the end of our own individual lives. And the thing that all of those things are reminding us of right now, it's not that we are strong, but that Christ is. And that is wonderfully glorious, resting truth for us to cast ourselves upon. So as we close, just a couple thoughts. Number one, do you realize that believing in the resurrection necessitates not believing in yourself? Believing in the resurrection doesn't just mean saying, I know I have my problems, but that's where Christ comes in to fix the stuff I'm not able to do. It actually means saying, actually, I don't just have my problems, I create my own problems all the time. I am my own problem. But that is exactly where the good news of Jesus begins. And you realize what good news that is, that you don't have to trust in your ability anymore. And until you do, you will continue to come up against that wall over and over and over again. But what does Jesus hold out and offer to his people? I will give you rest. Come to me who are weary and heavy laden, and you'll find rest for your souls. And I'm gentle and lowly in heart. And following from that, are you ready to live your life in a way that shows absolutely no trust in your own competency, but complete trust in the Lord? What if we as a church put all of our chips in on Jesus doing the work and not us? What does that look like? What does it look like for us to just simply open ourselves up and to pray, Lord, do something that we cannot do? I think when we do that, we'll be very impressed with what he's actually able to do when we get out of the way. And as we do that, what is that ultimately going to do? It's going to deepen our joy in God, because we'll see him not just simply as a God who is far and distant, but a God who is actively at work in our midst, our Redeemer, our Sanctifier, our Glorifier, and our friend. Let's cast ourselves upon that God. Let's look upon Christ, ask him to meet us when we come to the end of ourselves. And when we realize that we do not have what we need, he has abundantly provided for us so that we might have all that we could ever want in him.